Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Raw Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen and it's your job to draw what you see. We'll have an artist joining us, doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It is entirely up to you. Once the session is finished, don't forget to post your work onto Instagram and hashtag it with #RawUmberLive. You can also download the reference photographs and watch this video again after the session is finished. So if the artist is going too fast for you, don't worry. You can watch the video now and then watch it again later on. Right, let's get started.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another portrait drawing session here at Raw Umber Studios. I'm Luca Indraccolo, and we're gonna be starting with the simplest of tools here. I have just a 2B pencil, which is relatively soft and easy to erase for the first marks. And what I'm doing here, I'm pretty much figuring out where the head, so the portrait, is gonna be within the page. Now, as you can see, I haven't not put it necessarily right in the middle. I'm trying to have one of the eyes a bit closer to an imaginary middle line on the page. And the other thing that I've done, I moved the whole head up from that center point. And the reason is because I'm planning to draw sections of the neck, shoulders, probably the neckline of the shirt. So I'm allowing space for that. And in fact, the mark that you see at the bottom of the page is where I plan to have the bottom of the neckline of the shirt. Now, since this is a pretty much back to basics kind of demo that I'm doing here, I just want to really insist onto these first few lines and explain exactly what I'm doing here. So as you can see, I'm not using any curves, I'm using just straight lines, just to nail or be as accurate as I can in terms of the shape of the head. What I mean by that is that if I was drawing this with curves, the character, so the highest points and lowest points of this oval shape that is the human head, would be relatively hard to get right from the get-go. Whereas if I have straight lines like here, so for example, I've just seen that the whole head is a bit too wide, so I moved the edge of the ear and then I moved the edge of the face. And that is done by simply just removing two straight lines and replacing them. Now, of course, as a consequence, every time that I change a measure, there is a knock-on effect. So by making the face narrower, the neck has to become a lot narrower as well. So really take your time with this overall shape. We call this sometimes envelope shape or potato shape sometimes. And yeah, so just really take your time, stop, measure as much as you possibly can. Try to do it by eye first, but then to double check, stretch out your arm, and with the pencil, see how wide the width of the head in relation to the height on the reference is, and then you just make sure that the relationship between the width and the height of this simple box that we have is the same in your drawing. So as you can see, I've spent quite a bit of time to try and get as close as possible to the shape of the head of our model. Really the likeness starts from that. if I have the features, so the eyes, the nose, and everything that is relatively correct, but the shape of the head isn't right, the likeness wouldn't be as close as I would like it to be. So really spend a lot of time doing that. The next thing I do once I'm relatively happy with the shape of the head, I find the brow line. And the reason why I find the brow line and then the center line, so the symmetry line of the face, is because generally speaking, in terms of proportions, the bottom of the nose is roughly halfway between the top of the brow and the bottom of the chin. So in other words, once I have the brow line, I have the big distance between the brow and the chin that I can pretty much split in half, and I have a relative idea of where the nose is. The other thing here, even though it's not strictly speaking the face, I've just drawn the plane of the shoulders just to make sure that the two sides, so the two lines that I have on either side of the body indicating where the shoulders should be, they relate to each other. And the other thing that you want to do when confronted with a sitter that is pretty much looking straight on to camera, I'm trying to look for gesture, so for movement. I know this might be quite subtle, but the center line and the brow line are at a tiny bit of an angle, and the same thing with the shoulders. So I'm really trying to find as much movement as possible. Then once I've pretty much broken down the head, the size of the head into this big area, so I know roughly where the eyes are gonna go, the nose is gonna go, and the mouth, I'm starting by designing shadow shapes. So in other words, I'm not actually drawing the nose or the eye, but I'm focusing on the shadows and light shapes that are described by the form of the eye socket or from the side plane of the nose. Of course, you have to take into consideration where the light source is going to be. In our case, of course, it is on the right, and it's relatively higher than the position of the head, and we can tell that by the direction of the cast shadow past the nose. So these are all things that you don't have to invent, and the more portraits you draw, the more aware you are of these things. However, as I said before, I'm just trying to break down and explain what we're seeing here. But if you're very new to this, don't worry too much about the theory behind this whole thing. Just have a good look at the reference and just squint and try to design the shapes as you see them. And by shapes, I mean the patterns of light and dark. And when I feel that I've drawn enough shapes and I have a fairly good idea where the features are going to be within my portrait here, the next thing I usually do is start adding some tones, just a bit of value to make sure that my eye sees better what is meant to be light and what is meant to be dark. I say this all the time. I mean, the human eye is very partial to tones or values, however you want to call them. It's the easiest way for us to see and perceive things around us. So whenever we draw a line, it's not actually a very natural way of seeing. So as soon as I'm pretty much happy with what I've done, in terms I don't see major differences between the reference and my drawing, then I move on to this other phase. I'm not saying that the drawing is correct yet. There is a ton of work to do, and really portraiture is all about the likeness, and the likeness just comes from the accuracy of your drawing. So in other words, it's relatively easy to draw a believable face within an hour, but it's relatively difficult to make it look like the sitter. So that's where, you know, a bit more time is usually required for a portrait. But I'll try within the time that we have to get as close as I possibly can to give an impression of the sitter. And to do so, I've quickly moved on from the line stage into this more tonal phase of the drawing. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't be keeping moving the edges of the shadows. So essentially, I will be redesigning and shift everything around. But the concept is really just to be as close as you possibly can with the lines, then put down some tone, and then keep refining the drawing for the time that we have left. When designing the eyes, I know it looks like I'm drawing the iris and really just draw an outline around the eye, but what I'm looking at is also the negative space between the brow and the eye, and I know that I will be shifting the eyes a lot. So really, I'm not going with the tip of the pencil. As you can see, I'm using more of the side of it by holding it in this particular way rather than holding it like a pen. And really, for most of this process, I am squinting at the reference. So I'm trying to get an impression going on more than an accurate line, at least for now. Now, of course, the more we proceed with this, the more I will be shifting my grip on the pencil and go closer to the tip of it, hold it a bit more like a pen, as I was saying, and that will give me a sharper mark. But for now, yes, I'm gonna be mainly using the side of the pencil and just keep refining the shapes. Once I've established the main features, what I tend to do is start from the middle. So even though I'm not drawing exactly the space between the brow right now, my eye goes first to the shape in the middle called the glabella on the human skull, and then I look. Essentially, that is my starting point, and then I start from there and moved on to the left eye socket, and I looked at the width of the shadow shape. And the reason why I do this is because by starting from the middle of the nose and looking at the side planes of the nose, if I draw those correctly, the next thing is going to be drawing the corners of the eye, or essentially I know exactly where the corners of the eye are if the nose is correct. So if it makes any sense, we have started drawing the portrait with the outline, so with the shape of the head that we called envelope shape, and then I've moved on to put internal details. So I kind of blocked in where the features are in a rough way. And then to check this whole thing, I will start from the middle of the brows, so to speak, and work my way from the bridge of the nose outwards towards the left and towards the right. And I will concentrate on getting the band of the eyes, so that the whole section of the portrait that goes from left to right, where the eyes and the brows and the eye sockets are. And once I have that pretty well established, the next thing I will do, I will move down within the drawing, and I would sort out the nose, the tip of the nose, I should say, and I will relate the width of it with the corners of the eyes, let's say. It could be perfectly aligned, it could be wider, it could be narrower. And then once I've done that, I will move down from the nose to the lips via the philtrum, which is that little depression in the middle of the nose, between the nose and the lips. And once I have the distance correct, then I looked at the width of the lips, still in relation to the eyes. So if you imagine a vertical line that goes from the corner of the mouth up to the eye, I will kind of see how they line up or relate with each other. So really, it's a very simple system. So start from the middle of the brow, work your way across, and then work your way down, and relate everything to the eyes. That will ensure that most of your features will be in proportions with each other. I get asked a lot when, especially by students that aren't that experienced, what is really a shadow shape and what is a dark midtone. And really, there is no easy answer for that. So at the beginning I just squint and whatever makes sense to me, whatever I find more convenient, so I just make one big dark mass. But then later on in the drawing, as I'm doing here, I will put some darker accents for the true shadows, so the darkest part of the drawing. And then by doing so, the rest of the shadow shape that I have originally designed is gonna appear like a dark semitone. So that's essentially what's happening right here. So I'm focusing on the deepest part, so the darkest part of the brow, and then the cast shadow under the upper eyelid. Really establishing the darkest darks. Or here, for example, I'm trying to soften the edge of the shadow shape that I had designed before. So there is quite a clear structure that the shadow shape follows, which is the edge pretty much of the cheekbone. But also where the actual cheek is, it just becomes a lot softer. There is there are fatty pads right under that section of the skin, and so the edge of the shadow shape has to become softer. And the way I do that is by putting a tone right next to this very sharp line, and that visually softens the whole edge. Another thing that might be interesting for you guys to know is the fact that, generally speaking, the edge of a shadow shape is usually one of the darkest points. So what I mean by that, so for example, if we look at what I'm designing here, I'm really trying to pay a lot of attention to the edges of the shadow shape rather than the middle of it, if it makes any sense. Now, of course, if I've gone a tiny bit too dark, as I feel I have, I can darken the whole shadow shape, but still most of the work will be done on the edges of the shadows. And the same thing goes for reflected light. So if we look at the reference, we see that on the left side of the page, or the head I should say, there is a bit of a reflected light from the environment. So this kind of like bluish whitish light, right? And essentially the more we look at it, the brighter it will appear to our eyes. So the trick to represent it would be considering the fact that reflected light is still part of the shadow, so it's not going to be as bright as it appears. And rather than taking the rubber and lighten up that reflected light, what I'm going to be doing is actually darken the edge between the shadow shape and the reflected light. And by contrast, that will make the reflected light appear relatively brighter than the rest of the shadow shape. When drawing the eye, my first concern is really to try and make it look round. So as you can see here, I'm darkening the corners of the eyelid, and that will kind of give the impression of a sphere. So remember, the eye is an eyeball, right? And the other thing that happens is, if you can see under the upper eyelid, we actually have a cast shadow. So from the eyelid and the eyelashes onto the eyeball itself. But at the bottom, actually the lower eyelid catches light. And really what is dark is not the edge of the eyelid where the lashes are, but it's actually the skin below the eyelid, so the lower part of the eyelid. And again, so try to think of it as rendering a sphere rather than drawing a flat eye, or like an almond shape, as I like to call it. Think of it as a sphere first. So, make sure that the corners are dark, make sure that you follow the direction of light when you're rendering this. And even if you don't draw the eye all the way through, so what I mean is, even if you don't have a complete outline, so in other words, if you have a few gaps in those lines to indicate where the light is, the impression of the eye should be stronger and more realistic than if you were to design the whole eye as, like, let's say, a continuous almond shape. As I continue putting down some tones, really my attention shifts to the planes of the head. So what I mean here is, yes, I am adding a bit of tone and trying to make the head look a bit rounder, but really, as you can see, my linear thinking is still there. I'm still thinking about what is the front plane of the forehead, what is the part where the plane starts to shift between the front and the side of the head, and just establish each one of these planes as with a relative value. Same thing I've done just here with the side of the nose, so the right side looking at the drawing. And really I cannot stress enough how important it is to assign a relative value to different planes of the head. If you do that correctly, the impression of form should be there relatively quickly. And this is what I was talking about before in terms of the establishing the edge of the shadow shape next to the reflected light on the side of the head. Now, as you can see, the moment I go a bit darker with that edge, the reflected light appears too light. So the next thing I do, I just put a tone down to the whole thing. This process is called unifying or unifying the value planes. And essentially I'm just putting a tone down onto the entire shape so that those differences in tone, so this contrast, gets minimized. Okay, and up to now we've been just looking at the overall shapes and proportions. However, one of the things that has happened so far is the fact that the whole portrait looks a bit too smooth and gives the impression of a much younger model. So what I'm doing here, I'm adding details on the lines and really all the marks that make the character of the model really come to life. So I'm going to be spending a lot of time really trying to define the shapes as well as I can, as accurately as I can, to really get as close as possible to the likeness of the model. I mean, essentially that is the aim of a portrait, right? So I will be going back and forth with the edges of the shapes to make them as accurate as I can within the hour. When working on values, as you can see, I'm establishing a mark and I'm making it quite dark. And then the next thing I do, I kind of unify the whole thing. Here I'm trying to separate the bridge of the nose from the glabella. So, just to make sure that it doesn't look like the plane of the nose. So the front of the nose attaches directly to the forehead. There is usually always a depression between the eyes. So what I mean is like on the front plane of the nose, where the bridge of the nose is, usually goes in relation to the ridge of the brow, right? If you think of it in profile, we have the forehead, then there is kind of a protuberance where the ridge of the brow is, and then just below that there is a depression where the bridge of the nose starts, right? So how do we represent that from a front-on view is exactly what I've just done there, which is putting a bit of a darker tone just below the brows on the front plane of the nose. And again, the reason why I do that, and I think it's important that you guys do it as well, is because if you don't, it feels like, it looks like the light plane of the nose goes from the tip all the way to the forehead without interruptions, and that suggests that the nose attaches directly in between the brows, if you see what I mean, which is not the case really. So yeah, just try to really pay attention to these little value shifts, because they're very important to be able to describe the human form. Another thing I like to do when working on the corners of the mouth is just make sure that the corners have a really nice and soft transition. There is usually a depression created by the muscles around the mouth, around the corner of the mouth. So try not to have the corners of the lips being too sharp, because that's one of the things that flattens your drawings. It makes it look like a cartoon rather than a figurative or representational drawing. It becomes more of a comic book, more of a abstract design, if you see what I mean. So really try to soften the corners of the mouth as much as you possibly can. Now, in some people, those depressions and in the corners there are quite obvious and quite big. In some individuals are a lot smaller and barely visible, but there is always a bit of a halftone or shadow in the corner of the mouth. So really try and pay attention when you work on that area. This is something I probably should have mentioned before, but as I move on to these lighter halftones, I've actually switched pencils. So I have essentially 3 pencils, and the way I use them, so I have a 2B, B and an H, and 2B is the softest and darkest, and then the B is the kind of medium one, and the H is the hardest one, and therefore the lightest one in terms of marks, graphite marks. So depending on which area of the drawing I'm working on, I'm constantly switching between these pencils. Now you can see my left hand, which is out of frame, but I hold all of my pencils and the putty rubber in that one hand, and then quickly I shift, switch the pencils, I should say. So they're very close, and it's something that I'm doing constantly. And this is a little pencil eraser that I'm using. And I use that rather than the putty rubber when I want to have a much more precise and sharper white mark, so to speak. So I always say this: I consider the erasers or rubbers like this drawing instruments. So in other words, I'm not thinking about rubbing out mistakes, even though that's essentially what I'm doing sometimes, but I'm thinking of it almost as a drawing tool that allows me to draw the lights, if that makes any sense. When working on the eyes, and especially the iris, I don't know why, but most of us have the tendency to make the iris especially too big. I think it has to be a psychological, it has to have a psychological connotation, this sort of thing. And what I mean by that is, I believe that, or at least that's what my theory is the fact that the eyes are so important to us, especially in Western culture, right? We look at people in the eye, we call them the window to the soul, and so in our mind they become more important than they actually are visually, and therefore we tend to enlarge them, really. And this is something I've seen over the years, that it's a tendency that a lot of us have, and I'm not quite sure other than the reasoning I've just given. So just be careful about that. And one of the things I tend to do is I compare visually the size of the iris to the size of the nostril. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to be the same size or anything strict like that, but that just gives me an idea of the proportions of an individual face. So, you know, of course, people might have different sized noses, especially the tip and the nostrils, because that's cartilage, right? So it's not really bound by the bony structure of the skull per se. So really, that's the ears and the tip of the nose are some of the part of the portrait that are most variable in terms of structure and size and shape, again because it's cartilage, right? But nonetheless, I use the shape of the nose, or more precisely the nostrils, to really try and give me an understanding of the exact size of the iris when I draw the eyes. Even though I'm spending most of the time really trying to nail the shape of the eyes and the likeness, which takes forever. And, as I said at the beginning, it's quite a challenge to do within an hour. So, don't be too frustrated if you cannot get the likeness. Just make sure that the proportions of the face are correct, the planes of the head are correct. You're starting to get a three-dimensional form going on. And then if you have a bit more time, I would suggest, if you really want to nail the likeness of the model, just keep working for longer and keep being very strict about the accuracy of each shape you design. The other thing here is, yes, I could spend a lot more time on the face, which I probably will towards the end, but I'm also thinking about designing the entire piece. So I know at the end of the hour, that's probably going to be the end of this drawing for me. But so before that happens, I just want to make sure that the whole piece reads as one well-designed drawing. So I am not going to spend as much time on the neck and the shirt as I have on the portraits, of course, but I just want to make sure that nothing in the drawing is completely neglected, as I feel the neck is up to this point. And here we can have a little talk about design. I'm not gonna draw my lines all the way up to the edge of the paper. Feel free to do so if you like. I just like to create a bit of gesture, so again, a bit of movement. And as you can see, the shoulder on the on our right, I kept that line intentionally shorter. I don't want to make it symmetrical, remember? I don't want to make what I call a mug shot, So I shifted the face slightly to one side, as I said before. And now, to balance the shift, I am extending the drawing on one side, so onto the left, just to create a tiny bit of movement onto the page. Otherwise, it really will look like a passport photo, if you see what I mean. So I've chosen this kind of relatively front-on pose precisely for the fact that I wanted to talk proportions, so we don't have any extreme angles. We have a slightly low angle view, so we're looking slightly up at this portrait. However, it's relatively front-on, and I wanted to show you how to add a bit of dynamic movement into something that could otherwise be very static. But also, this pose really allows us to see the relationships between the features and like how the proportions of the human skull essentially work. So you can take this and of course apply to 3/4 profile. Anything goes, really. I mean, once you've drawn a head successfully, and once you understand what to look for, of course you can apply this to every other portrait you'll ever be confronted with. As I continue to render and break down the shapes into more and more subtle transitions, I just wanted to talk a bit about the difference between drawing and learning to draw from photographs versus learning to draw from life. So, of course, photographs are an amazing tool, especially nowadays. You know, there is so much out there in terms of model artist references. And so that's invaluable. Like even here at Raw Umber, there is a huge archive of very varied models, individuals. You can have figures, drawings. So this is something that I wish I had at my disposal when I started drawing. However, there is something to be said also about drawing from life. So, and what I mean by that is that usually in a photograph the shapes are a lot clearer and they're already two-dimensional. So in other words, the camera has done the work that the human eye usually does when observing nature and drawing and painting. So what I suggest is keep drawing from photos, especially if you're just starting out. But every now and then, if you can, try to draw from life as well. And it doesn't have to be something very public. You don't have to necessarily go to a place where you'll be intimidated by either artists around you, or you feel a bit of the pressure. I would say, especially when it comes to portraiture, the easiest thing to do is probably just sit in front of a mirror and just draw, do a self-portrait. Now, as an exercise, this is very, very useful, and I would go between doing something like this and then back to drawing from a photograph. And what that should do should inform you about the actual three-dimensional form of a nose, of the chin, of the lips, because if you're not too sure about what you're drawing, what you're seeing in the mirror, or how to represent it, you can draw onto your experience with photographs where these shapes have been flattened already. However, it's very good for you to be able to design those things from observation and from observing the three-dimensional object in the first place. So yeah, as everything in life, balance is very important. So I would say draw from photos, but also try to balance that with a bit of work from life. As I mentioned before, I've been trying to add a bit more character to this very smooth blocking of a face that I had before, and I'm adding a few lines here and there to represent a bit more clearly the age and the character of our sitter. Now, this is the part of a portrait when you can be a bit flattering. So what I mean by that is, even though you might be drawing or trying to represent a older person, the trick is really not to leave out some of the lines, but the idea is to draw everything that you see, but just lightly change the value. So what I mean by that, I could have gone a lot darker with those lines on the side of the nose, on the side of the mouth, but that would age a lot the model. And what I'm trying to do is again, not to make it look like a teenager, but also not to make it look like an 80-year-old person. So really it's about striking that balance by suggesting those lines and those features on the human portrait, but also make sure that you don't go overboard, so you don't over describe those things, because that can add a few years onto the impression of the person that you're trying to represent. And as we are approaching the end of the hour, I just wanted to say thank you for everybody for joining me tonight. I know that for some of you, this might have been the repetition of something you might have already known, as I pretty much covered some of the more basic things when looking at the portrait. But nonetheless, I hope all of you have enjoyed it. And please let me know if you would like to see anything in particular. Just let me know in the comments and I'll try to cover it in my next few videos. Anyways, thank you again for joining me, and I'll see you soon with another drawing.
I hope you enjoyed the session and thank you for taking part. Don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with hashtag Raw Umber Live. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 PM and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 PM. The last portrait session of every month is free. Thank you and goodbye.